I'm not pulling on my driveway. We all know what that means. It's time for another Drive to Work, Coronavirus Edition. Okay, so I've been meeting with R&D of past and present to talk about sets we worked on together. So today, my guest is Dave Humpherys to talk about Ikoria. Hey, Dave.
Hey, everyone.
Okay, so what is your earliest memory of Ikoria?
Let's see. Yeah, I think I remember. I was on Vision. I remember us trying to figure out mutate. Certainly, that was like one of the earlier things I remember. I know, I felt like we knew that this would sort of be right in our mind. It was kind of the like monsters on a kind of almost tropical island sort of vibe, or I forget exactly what like Monster Islandish sort of vibe. So I don't know. I was pretty excited by that. I've always. Right, I'm a biologist by training, now a game designer, but I don't know, like a lot of that passion comes from just being really interested in stuff like mutations and animals and weird variants of, creatures throughout the world, our world and fantasy worlds.
So just so the audience understands, so I led the vision design and Dave led the set design. And you like being on vision design. Not all set designers are on the vision design, but you enjoy being on the vision design.
Yeah, I do try to be somewhat hands-off compared to if I were on a vision design for, say, another a set that I wasn't going to be leading later. But yeah, I like to be there to sort of steer things where I see that I'm going to be excited to take over. I try not to shoot down ideas too much, and I try to like hear out what's exciting other people. But yeah, I definitely like to be in a position where if it looks like stuff's not working, or if I see problems, or I can point out problems that I foresee earlier so that your team can tackle those themselves, rather than, me having to tackle them later on in cases where you might not have an opportunity to revisit stuff that you're excited about for other reasons.
So real quickly, just to fill the audience in, originally, this was Cricket was its code name. Cricket was supposed to be Theros, and originally Eldraine was going to be 2 sets, and the third set was going to be Theros. But we decided to just make Eldraine 1 set, and then Theros got moved up. And then this idea came from something we had planned for like 2 years later, and Monster Island was our shorthand for it. Okay, so I know early on, Mutate is something we started very early on. So what is your early memories of Mutate?
I remember that the idea was that you had to mutate your creature over a creature that shared a keyword or a creature type, that was like what we saw as the most thematic representation of like it's evolving to its kind of next level. But you had to sort of be going along a path that made sense thematically. And again, we had, at least even towards handoff, we had like inheritable keywords. So we were trying to define perhaps even like, which keywords would be most prominent in the set. And we were also gridding out all the colors so that each color had a most prominent creature type. And that did get preserved throughout the process, even if it didn't matter mechanically in the ways, just in like white was focused on cats and red on dinosaurs and green on beasts and blue on elementals. And I forgot what I didn't say.
Black is nightmares, right?
And in that case, the mutating creature gained any keyword or any keyword counters or counters, any keywords in the form of these inheritable keyword counters, potentially, or, and that was mostly what it was carrying over. It was carrying over keywords, not the rest of the text like we changed it to during set design.
So let me just explain something you were saying so the audience understands this. When we said inheritable keywords, what that meant was keyword counters were included very early in, and in fact, they were intertwined originally with mutate. So the idea was if I mutated on top of a creature and it had any of the abilities that existed as a keyword counter, those keywords would get counters and go on the creature. Because in the original version of mutate, you didn't, like the later mutate in set design, you got all the abilities of the creatures you were on, but that wasn't true originally.
Yep.
So that's interesting. So when I handed off the set to you, Right. The way you would mutate things is you would the things had to share either a ability word or they had to share a creature type, and then you made the change to sort of just it copied everything. What got you to make that change?
Yeah, I mean, some of it was actually just the draft itself was pretty complicated. Like you draft like a creature with first strike, and then you draft a cat, and then you'd see like I don't know, you'd see a mutate creature that was a dinosaur, and then you'd see a mutate creature that was a beast, and meanwhile, it was just kind of overwhelming for players in draft, like not in a fun way, like. Again, like there's a certain amount of complexity and whatnot that's certainly fun and people enjoy solving. But yeah, this was just not the complexity that people were finding fun. So I think that was like, I guess the main reason that I saw change. I mean, there's also issues with backwards compatibility. Like right. I mean, if we want to most excite people with our new set, in many cases, we want to like show them cards that like will fit into decks that they have built their favorite standard deck, their favorite commander deck or whatever. And right, like just odds are that, someone might not have a deck that can easily incorporate these cards if they're asking for more specific things. So yeah, I wanted to try it where, right, that these could mutate over anything that was not human. And then, I got agreement, I think it was from Doug at the time, if I'm remembering the leads right, where like, that we kind of just agreed that like all the humanoids here would be humans, so that like we wouldn't have, I don't know, goblins or elves mutating into these things, and like at least within the world we could still pretty well maintain some sense of like, monsters mutating into more out there and wild monsters. And I forget. So somewhere in that, yeah. So we switched that, and as well we switched to like that. Just all of the text would carry over. I mean, that was just more of a consideration for how splashy they were. Right. That again, it felt like worth trying, and then I didn't really ever get too much pushback. I mean, again, there is complexity in that, but at the same time, it's exciting to be able to like mix and match text between creatures, and there's a lot of fun in terms of getting like a pinger and a death toucher together, or all various other sorts of combinations you could get. And I was just going to say, just on the backwards compatibility too, like some of it was just having the play designers starting to give input and like that. Right. If you could only build a deck around nightmares, that was going to be pretty limiting in terms of like how much exploration players could really do with those decks, as opposed to the more open-ended versions of all these.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that one of the decisions we make all the time in game design is the change in mutate both made it easier in some way and more complicated in other ways. Like you're always like. It's not as if every decision makes everything simpler or more complex. There's a fluidity to it, right? You made it easier to play and easier to kind of draft and build a deck around, but individually understanding what creatures did became more complex.
Right. I mean, overall, the complexity probably went up, but again, the complexity that was getting added was just, in a much more enjoyable form, I felt.
Yeah, and that's an important part, which is sort of when we do things that are complex. And one of the things about Ikoria is we definitely tested with pushing complexity a little more than normal. The set definitely was a little more loaded than the average set had been. But we were doing that on purpose. And one of the things was we thought the complexity was kind of fun complexity rather than kind of busy complexity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the counters, because you were very instrumental in the keyword counters. So let's talk about the origin of keyword counters.
Yeah, so right, so I led Amonkhet, the development of Amonkhet, and in that process, I was looking at like I was part of introducing like, we can put into packs like these counters for +1/+1 counters, and we also had brick counters I guess it was -1/-1 counters and brick counters, and in that process, at some point during design, I was like, like if we're going to put these in packs, like we could do sort of more interesting counters, like we could do keyword counters. And I'd mentioned that to Aaron, and like again at that point the set was already like Amonkhet already kind of had too many things going on, so I just put it more in the back of my mind. I want to pitch this for some later set, and if I remember correctly, then like we ran sort of the brainstorming teams where you were leading sort of like, sort of a study, like, what else can we do for some of our upcoming sets? And like in that meeting, I pitched to you, who was running that team, like, hey, we could do keyword counters again. And I know you latched onto that and then sort of ran with that at the beginning of vision design before I was even very heavily involved.
Yeah. So we had done a hackathon basically where it was on future design space. And so we chopped up things. And one of the things that we looked at was other game components. And then one of the subsets of other game components was punch-out cards. And so the team I had worked on was, okay, what are all the cool things we could do with punch-out cards? And you had pitched keyword counters. And so that's something we explored during that week. And they were really fun. Like there's a lot of nice, very simple, elegant things you could do with them. So when we got to the idea of doing mutate, I was very excited of maybe mutating could involve using keyword counters. And like they were very linked early on. And then as they sort of separated, both stayed in the set, but they didn't overlap as much.
Yeah, I mean, at some point they didn't really become crucial to the execution of mutate at all. They became their own thing. I mean, one of the things I do like about Ikoria is how well it kind of does stay on theme of like, right, I mean, this is, it's kind of the build your own monster, or, make your creature ever more exotic and powerful and unusual. And like, yeah, I mean, I do feel most of the mechanics build pretty well towards that.
Yeah, one of the big things I know in Vision, which you carried over in set design, was like, one of the goals of any Vision thing is just having what I call bullseye. Like, what are you aiming for? And this was the monster set. It was always the monster set. And the idea of building your own monsters was a big part of it. So let's talk about a different mechanic that let you sort of build things, Companion. So what is your memory of Companion?
Yeah, I mean, Companion also sort of originated in the hackathon. It was actually, it was part of a team that I was leading, where, yeah, we were taking in a bunch of ideas, on things that could eventually show up in sets. And it came about sort of as a synthesis of, like, I think two separate ideas where, it was both looking at, people were interested in some sort of, like, component that started the game in play. And then there was also, like, sort of like an entirely separate part of the brainstorm that people were excited to investigate, was like some sort of deck building restrictions, like, and right, like, we have these things to various things, or, some of our formats certainly have components of these, especially when talking about Commander and, start of the game component. So many of these formats to some extent also have a deck building restriction. So yeah, I mean, in leading that team, and, certainly had others helping me to get to that point, but yeah, like it dawned on me that we could bring both of these things together in a way where, like, well, you can't really start with this, like, extra component at the beginning of the game because that's, like, really powerful. But, well, what if that's offset by a deck building restriction that then, it is a strong enough concession in deck building that, like, we can give you something at the start. And again, that didn't necessarily need to be a whole card or anything like that, but that was mostly the genesis of it. And I think this is one of those things that I brought up to you during Vision of like we want to show, the humans bonding with creatures here. And like, I think Companion could have showed up in quite a few different sets, but I did genuinely feel like, oh, well, like, right. Like, what shows off better, like you bonding with, like, a powerful creature than, like, somehow starting with this creature at the start of the game. Like, it's you and this creature kind of against the world or against your opponent or whatever. And like, it felt like a pretty good match here in a way that I was excited about, especially since I had been in on initial brainstorming. Right. I mean, of course, we made some errors along the way, and I think course corrected in some pretty cool ways. But yeah, that was the genesis of how it started.
So one of the big challenges, and this was a lot more set design, I mean, we did some of it in early Vision, but was trying to find constraints for companions. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, I mean, it's tricky. Like, yeah, first of all, yeah, you need the constraints to be, again, hard enough that we can be giving you a reward. We need the constraints to be, like, roughly equal in, like, how hard they are to do. Right, so that, like, we can sort of have these cards operating on a similar mechanical level, right? Like, I mean, we wanted them to work in limited and constructed. We wanted them to be like cards you'd still consider putting in your deck. Like, I mean, like in some ways we put probably too many constraints on ourselves for all the things that we wanted them to do. But yeah, like, I mean, yeah. And again, at some point, like some people are like, we're really allergic to this idea, like not necessarily in the ways that the public responded against them, but like a lot of people were like, what if my opponent's cheating, or what if they didn't really follow rules? And a lot of people were really, really concerned about this, especially in paper play, in ways that I wasn't necessarily expecting. Right. Like in my mind, it's just like, I mean, there's a certain amount of, right, like you if your opponent plays Lightning Bolt against you, you assume they have 4 in their deck and not 5 or 6 or whatever, right? Like there's a certain amount of built-in assumption that, like, I don't know, some of our mechanics like get shot down for fear of cheating, but for the most part, I feel like we have to assume that for the most part, people are going to operate in good faith and not shoot down mechanics too easily. Like, I mean, that said, we do need to work in ways to make compromises to the folks that are worried about it. Like I did get rid of a lot of the constraints on them that I felt were too hard to keep an eye on if you were worried about that sort of thing. Like,
so
right,
can you give me some examples of ones you threw out?
I'm trying to think of like I'm going to struggle now to come up with them on the spot, but right, there were some where it was like where we could even make compromises. It's like, I guess one of the better examples is like you had to play like 16 creatures in your deck or something like that, where it's like, well, that would be verifiable on a deck list or whatever, but then like, how do you know if they really had like 16 creatures in their deck? And I'm just throwing that as an example where it could have been a different card type and a different number, but
yeah, there was a tribal card, for example, where like a certain number, you had to pick a tribe, and a certain number had to be that tribe, right?
Right. And that relates to, what is it? Ikoria is sort of like an example of that in the end, where like we like that design started sort of in the space we're talking about. In the end, it was like, like we're just going to make the reward for that card so centric on playing creatures. And then we're not going to even really care if you play creatures. Like we're going to, you can play it in a creatureless deck, even though it says like all your stuff has to, if you have a creature, it has to be that type. But, right. In the end, I tried to get to the point where they're like, as soon as your opponent did something that didn't match, it would be pretty obvious. Like I think like Lutri is the hardest one to kind of keep track of, because that's the singleton one. And you might not immediately know if your opponent was trying to work around that. But yeah, I mean, I think in the real world that became less of a concern. Ultimately, the way things played out, or companions had bigger issues. But yeah, I mean, again, it's weird. I mean, I think Lutri in some ways was one of the first like kind of proof of concept cards that I had made in my mind. I mean, it actually ends up being one of the harder deck building restrictions in many ways.
Okay, so let's move on to there's one more named mechanic in the set, which is a returning mechanic, which is cycling. So what is your earliest memory of cycling?
I mean, I think it was kind of just always there. I mean, again, as I had mentioned, I had led Amonkhet, so I felt like I had lessons learned there a little bit and wanted to be more aggressive this time around. But I mean, cycling made a ton of sense to me, just as like, like, I mean, I kind of love reanimator decks in terms of like my historical preferences for like deck types and Magic. And, like if we're going to try to get you to play big creatures, and putting cycling on them is a good way to make sure you don't get punished for including too many big creatures in your deck, so that, then you can try to play more than you otherwise would. And we could set up some sort of reanimator strategies, which we did like for the green-black color pair. So, I mean, yeah, I was very on board with cycling. I mean, the other thing that cycling, I mean, one of the choices we made with cycling in the set is that we did start to lean on it eventually as a sort of a color fixing mechanic in some sense, by having a lot of colorless cycling. In some ways that burned us in the end, or at least it burned us with like having too much 1 mana colorless cycling with Zenith Flare and limited. But yeah, I mean, I was totally on board with the mechanic in terms of matching some of the goals that we, some of the weaknesses of trying to deliver on a big creature set. I mean, I know even for some people, Ikoria didn't feel like enough of a big creature set, but it's really hard to deliver on a set that's just like all a bunch of huge creatures. That's, the gameplay there is fraught with peril, or has other issues potentially in the ways, that we saw with, like, say, Rise of Eldrazi or something.
Right. So it's interesting. Rise of Eldrazi really was kind of like front and center the whole time in design, because Brian Tinsman, when he made Rise of Eldrazi, his whole attitude was, I want you playing with big creatures. I'm just going to slow down the early game so you do that. And what ended up happening was the people that understood what was going on had a really good time with it. But the players that just said, I don't know what's going on, I'm just going to play normal Magic, just had bad experiences because it didn't let you just kind of play normal Magic. You kind of had to buy into it. And so one of my goals, I know, and passed along to you, was we wanted you to opt. If you wanted to play big creatures, you could, but it wasn't like you didn't have to play big creatures. And that was a big difference between Rise of Eldrazi and Ikoria to me.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think, like, yeah, I mean, in the end, like, the big creatures actually ended up a little bit on the weak side for limited anyways. Right. I mean, yeah, if anything, like, yeah, I mean, the human component was pretty strong. Like, I mean, I am really happy with the way some of the subtle stuff ended up too, like the allied color pairs, where I chose to focus more on, like, other themes and pushed kind of the keyword overlaps on the allied color pairs kind of as their own strategies, with some other texture in there actually tended to, like, work out. Yeah, I mean, surprisingly well. Like, there were a lot of things to do for a set that was kind of focused more towards enemy colors and wedges. Like, I mean, the allied colored strategies worked pretty well in some cases. Right. I mean, again, some of that got overshadowed, I feel, by, like, how strong the Cycling deck was as well in limited. But I feel like, other than overshooting on Zenith Flare, there was just, like, a ton that was lovable about the limited environment.
Well, you bring up wedges, so let's talk wedges. So we knew pretty early on that we were going to have a wedge component to the set. It wasn't a wedge set, meaning that there wasn't lower rarity cards really that had wedge colors or anything. It's at higher rarities. But we knew. So, what is your memory of how wedge came to the set?
Yeah.
So. My memory of wedge is sorry, I just lost you, Dave. So go ahead.
Oh yeah. Yeah, my internet probably went out real quick. Yeah, I mean, I think, like, pretty early on, I had at least been advocating for it as a wedge set. Like, I think having the spring set be a wedge set where we push strong 3-color stuff is just a good timing for 3-color environment, where it's just going to be in the standard environment for a shorter period of time. I did make it pretty clear that, like, I felt like, right, like, I wasn't going to deliver on, like, a Cons of Tarkir where there's a factionalized mechanic for each wedge and that sort of thing. Like, right, this was a monster set. This was not a wedge set. This was more like, this is our opportunity to give players wedge, 3-color cards and excite them because people love those cards. Like, but yeah, I mean, I wanted it to be, like, very clear that I was not delivering on, like a Cons of Tarkir style set. Certainly we can do sets like that in the future. This was more just delivering on cool 3-color cards because we know people like them, and this is, timing wise in the year, I felt like a good place to do it. And I think it also helped tie in a little bit to, like, just the structure of mutations and, right, like, in our minds, it was like all these, wild hybrids of this creature and that creature, and then at the top is, like, a cat nightmare, elemental, or whatever the combination of things was in the wedge. I don't know if I just gave an accurate example, but it seemed to kind of fit in other ways with what we were doing.
Yeah, like, one of the things that, like I said, was that each color had its own creature type, monster creature type, and then as you started blending them with colors, they would start blending together. So, if black was nightmare and green was beast, it become a nightmare beast when you blend them together, and that goes through the 2-color all the way up into the 3-color.
Yep. Yeah. It also just let us do stuff. I mean, I know there were some concerns like that, monsters aren't going to be for everyone. Monsters, not everyone. Some people are going to find this too childish or too whatever the reason is that they don't like, creatures or monsters, or they like spells, or they like, something with that seems set up to be more story driven for other reasons. So like I felt like Wedge was just another thing that we knew people liked, that they could latch on to, that we could deliver on stuff like the ultimatums and the tri-lands and other things like that would excite a different group of players who might not be as big a fan of our main theme.
Yeah, that's something it's funny. We always want to have a main theme, but we always say, okay, but what are the players who don't like the main theme? What are they going to play? And so there's always a balance there between hitting the theme as much as we can, but also providing a few tangential things in the set. So let me ask about, you mentioned human tribals. That's another theme of the set. Because one of the things that I know we did in the set was we looked at the tropes of monsters. And one of the big tropes, one of them is bonding. We talked about companions. But another big one is just fighting, right? Is that humans fight monsters. And so the human tribal really played into that. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, especially once we set up the divide for mutative being human and, or being non-humans, like, right, the big sort of conflict engine as we talk about it for this world is, monsters versus monsters, monsters versus humans. Like, those are the big, right, that's what this world is kind of all about. And I feel like most monster movie type things like that is also a big part of it. It's like the monsters versus the humans, kind of the monsters, toppling down the humans' environment to some fashion. And, the humans having various success in fighting against the monsters. I felt like we needed that component here. I centered it in white, black, color pair. I don't know that I have a whole lot to add here other than I felt like we wanted... right, that component of like, a force fighting against the monsters to be a pretty prominent thing here, in addition to the bonding angle you talked about.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time here, so I just want to hit one last thing that was a big part of the set, although it happened very late in the process, which was the Godzilla cards. So what is your memory of how the Godzilla skins came to be?
Yeah, that was more coming from, again, the main person I interacted with on our team was Mike Turian, and, that it became kind of more slowly more of a real thing. For a while I wasn't sure it was going to happen, and, we'd reach an agreement on it. At some point, there was the buy a box, like Zilortha, Godzilla card that I kind of made from scratch once that process started. Otherwise, like a lot of the cards were more kind of pre-existing by the stage this all came together, and I was working with kind of our artists and kind of conceptor and a creative team about like what are the best matches for all of the various creatures in their IP, like which design sounds like the most like this creature, and modified some stuff a little, but a lot of it was matching to cards that were already in the file.
Right, because this happened pretty late in the process. Like the set was mostly done. It was you took cards that already existed and converted them for the skins. You didn't make brand new cards.
Right. Yeah. The Godzilla card was the only
right.
Card
The buy box. Yeah.
Yeah, and even that may have partially pre-existed. Right, like because even that card probably could have spoke more to Godzilla. I did feel like that was just kind of a very unique line of text on that card where sort of everything's it's kind of the opposite of a Doran. Everything's toughness is really its power.
Yeah. So we're almost ready to wrap up here, but any final thoughts on Ikoria that you want to share that we didn't hit upon yet?
Yeah, I guess one of the things I think about with the set most, of course, is just companion. I do feel like, right, the solution to spend mana to put them into your hand actually was your suggestion. It was a suggestion that had never come up during playtesting at all or before release. I think it was a very clever solution to the situation we found ourselves in. In retrospect, I look at that a lot, and it's like, wow, I really wish someone had suggested that during design, because I think that actually lets us solve a lot of problems. Like we had to so much apply it as a Band-Aid, and like everything's 3 to put into hand. But I feel like if we had the mana cost to put it in hand as a knob for us, like, if it was 2 for this one and 4 for this one, and like if we could have used that as a knob as a way to, like, depending on how hard it was to meet the conditions, that would have solved a lot of things for us. So I don't know. It's again, as a designer, it's mostly just an interesting kind of case study for me of like, if we, like we talk about how can we get more knobs on cards, numbers we can turn that, makes balancing things easier, where, right, that like, I think, I think we could have done a lot better job with them. I mean, I do hope, I do hope that a lot of people have gotten joy out of them, and, in the form that they ended up with. I mean, I think I personally had a blast with them in draft.
Yeah, they were a lot of fun. They were a lot of fun to draft around. It's one of the things that when thinking of future stuff, we often think about that. Like, how do you give people something to draft that really changes the way they draft, which is a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, but I mean, they've been a big part of Magic. I mean, I do hope people, I hope there are still a lot of people that enjoy, like, what, the change that they brought to the game. I know a lot of people don't like them, but I am curious what people think of them in the final form they ended up ignoring as much as they can where they started.
Well, Dave, I am now at my desk. So we all know what that means. This is the end of my drive to work. So instead of talking magic, it's time for me to be making magic. So thank you, Dave. Thanks for joining us and talking all about Ikoria.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for listening.
Okay, guys, I will see all you next time. Thanks, Dave. Bye-bye.
Yep.